TikTok, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the world. I'm your friendly neighborhood philosopher, David Wood, and with me now is Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for having me on. How are you doing, David?
I'm good. Um, Now, you have sort of an interesting background. Why don't you share a little bit about? I know you have a doctor in front of your name, so why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about that?
Sure. So, just to give a rundown of my educational background, I did my bachelor's degree at University of Strathclyde in forensic biology, which is the application of scientific evidence to crime scene investigation. So, did that for 4 years, and then I fell in love with the world of molecular biology and was really struck in particular by the engineering prowess and designoid characteristics of living organisms. Was often rather baffled at how anyone could go through a 4 year university program in the natural sciences and come out an atheist at the other end, because the evidence seemed to me to be so compelling for the truth of theism. So I subsequently, following my bachelor's degree, did a master's degree in evolutionary biology to try to gain a better understanding of the evolutionary perspective. And then I interned for a year at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, helping Stephen Meyer with his book, Darwin's Doubt. And then I did a subsequent master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience, and then which was at Newcastle University. And then finally, I did a PhD studying the evolution of the eukaryotic cell cycle, the cell division cycle, which was also a university. I'm a professor of biology at a Christian school called Sattler College in Boston, Massachusetts. So I teach various biology-related courses, including freshman biology, genetics and genomics, microbiology. I teach bioethics. So that's just a little bit of my educational background. I'm also currently pursuing a master's degree at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is in biblical studies as well. So
Two quick follow-up questions based on some stuff you just said. Now, you said you're baffled by how someone can go through, an education in the sciences and come out an atheist, but you have a doctorate in evolutionary biology. So doesn't that explain how we got to where we are? Like, how can you be thinking that there's no good atheistic explanation for this stuff when you've literally got a doctorate in the explanation?
yeah, so obviously I don't find the explanation particularly satisfying. I think that there are certain features of biological systems which are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an unguided stochastic process, such as chance and physical necessity. In terms of evolution, there are a number of real scientific challenges, I think, to the naturalistic scenario of life's origins and evolution on Earth. So, for example, I think that there's merit to Michael Behe's concept of irreducible complexity, and I think that there are many thousands of such systems in biology. And basically, an irreducibly complex system is where you have a higher level objective that's accomplished by multiple subcomponents or multiple subfunctions that have to work together in concert to achieve that higher level objective. And so any process that's capable of producing that type of system is going to have foresight in order to visualize a complex end goal and bring together everything needed to realize that end goal. So an example of an irreducibly complex system would be the DNA replication machinery, by which the cell will duplicate its DNA to prepare for cell division. And there are a number of components that are necessary for that to work. You've got the DNA polymerase that actually carries out the copying. You have the initiation proteins that open up the DNA double helix or unwind the DNA double helix. You've got the helicase that breaks the hydrogen bonds that link the bases together to allow for copying. You have the single-stranded binding proteins that bind to the single strands of DNA and prevent them from reannealing. The DNA polymerase isn't able to begin copying unless it's first primed, because it needs what's called a 3' hydroxyl group in order to copy. So you have a primase enzyme which synthesizes the short primer and so forth. That's just a very short sketch of some of the components needed. The DNA polymerase also needs to be clamped onto the strand of DNA. It has a sliding clamp, and the sliding clamp itself has to be loaded on by a clamp loader, and so on. You have topoisomerase enzymes that alleviate the supercoiling that's induced by the torsional stress, and so on. If any of those components and many more were missing, then you wouldn't have DNA replication machinery that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to, but it would be broken. And this is one of my favorite examples of irreducible complexity, because natural selection presupposes differential survival. You can't have natural selection unless you have differential survival, but differential survival requires that you have self-replicability. And so you can't really invoke natural selection to explain the origins or the emergence of self-replicability without assuming the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain. So that's just one small challenge to evolution. There's a lot more that one could say on that.
Yeah, I was just on a long car ride with Ridvan, the apostate prophet, and we ended up talking about that a little bit. And I was just pointing out that in order for evolution to even get off the ground, what you need from the beginning, as far as something that is capable of evolving. So right there from the beginning, whatever life forms, it has to be capable, one, of replicating itself. So it's not just some sort of life that forms and then eventually dies and then there's nothing else. It has to be capable of replicating itself. Two, it can't make exact copies of itself, because then you have no variation, and there's nothing for, there's no variation to act on. But three, it has to be very similar to the original in order to preserve any good traits. And so you need something very specific in order to get the entire process off the ground. And I don't know, seems pretty amazing that you get that right from the beginning. I mean, imagine like a factory or something like that, building a factory that replicates factories, and that's like the first factory, and it's capable of replicating other factories or something.
Exactly. And for molecular machines, like what I just described, what you require are multiple proteins, many different proteins that have to be very specifically crafted in order to work together to achieve this higher level objective. And so the probabilities of getting even one protein are, in my judgment, astronomically small. But the probabilities just multiply exponentially when we're requiring multiple components to work together in concert to achieve a higher level objective. Even the simplest organisms, like Mycoplasma genitalium, for example, which is a bacterial cell, which is it's an obligate parasite, and it's not free living. It can't live outside of a host, and it's one of the simplest known organisms, and yet it still requires about 300 genes, 300 different proteins. So it's the complexity of even the simplest life is just absolutely mind-boggling and way beyond what can be plausibly accounted for by a stochastic, unguided process that doesn't have a mind involved. And so, in summary, when we observe these sorts of irreducibly complex systems and information-rich systems, information processing and retrieval apparatus that we find inside the cell, these sorts of things are phenomena which are habitually associated in every realm of experience with conscious deliberation or intelligent agency. And so it's not particularly surprising, on the hypothesis that a mind was involved, that you'd find information-rich systems such that we find in biology. But it is wildly surprising on the falsity of that hypothesis. And so it tends to, in fact, strongly confirm the design hypothesis over the non-design hypothesis, which in turn lends credence to a theistic worldview.
And when normal people who don't have a science background hear protein, they're only thinking in terms of nutrition, right? Like, I need to get a certain amount of protein. There's a certain amount of protein in this food. If I'm working out, I need to get my protein. When you talk about proteins in living organisms, these are basically things that are the structures in living things that are doing all the work in terms of how would you describe it in terms of these parts? They're like little machines performing little functions, right?
Right. So enzymes are comprised of subunits called amino acids, and basically the sequential arrangement of those amino acids will determine how a protein will collapse into a three-dimensional structure, and that three-dimensional structure will determine how the protein behaves within the cell, whether it might contribute to some biochemical pathway, or it might contribute to some larger molecular machine. So that is a function of proteins in biology.
And when you talked about how improbable it is to get a protein, so amino acids arranged in a sequence, they have to be in a certain sequence in order for this to collapse into something that actually performs the relevant function. It was in Signature in the Cell. Dr. Myers described the probability of getting these proteins, and I forget what it's called, but there's you can actually calculate the maximum possible number of of particle interactions since the beginning of the universe. By you take the entire number of seconds from the beginning of the universe and you multiply that by the fastest possible interactions between particles. So you set the speed of light as an upper limit. So assume that every particle is interacting at the speed of light. And then you multiply that times the number of particles in the universe, and it's around 10 to the 80th power. And you get this number, and there you have the entire possible maximum number of particle interactions since the beginning of the universe. And when you get that number, and then you say, okay, here's the probability of getting a relevant medium length protein chain. And given the time available in the universe, you're not even close to getting one medium length protein. So the idea that you're getting the hundreds you would need for the most basic known life, all in the same place to where they can come together and form the cell, seems astronomically improbable. I'm bringing this up because human beings seem pretty good with simple probabilities, right? Like if I flip a coin, 1 and 2, we get 1 and 2. If it's rolling, some dice, we get the idea of the probability of rolling dice. Once you start getting into like your probability of winning the lottery, it's like let's say 1 in 17 million or something like that. There we're not very good at it, and that's why people keep playing. But then when you're talking about like 1 in 10 to the 10 to the this, it's just our minds aren't very good at processing these kinds of probabilities. And so we think, but there's a long time in the universe, and there's a lot of space in the universe, there's a lot of stars, and therefore it could happen. When actually, mathematically, you can calculate the probabilities, even given gigantic space and tons of particles and so on, and you're still not even close to getting what you need.
Absolutely, you're completely correct. This is what Dembski calls the universal probability bound, right? The available probabilistic resources at one's disposal. And because when you're calculating the improbability of an event, that must always be relative to the probabilistic resources at one's disposal. So, for example, an analogy I sometimes give is imagine an ATM machine. We've all used ATM machines, and let's say that you've stolen someone's bank card, but you don't know the PIN number, and you put the bank card into the ATM machine. Well, there's 10 digits on the 10-digit PIN pad, right? There's 0 to 9, and there's a 4-digit PIN number that you have to guess, and so that's equivalent to 10,000. There's 10,000 possible ways you could dial in a 4-digit number to a 10-digit PIN pad. That's 10 to the 4th power. Now, most banks will lock you out of your account after 3 failed attempts at guessing the right PIN number. And so if you only have 3 attempts, that corresponds to the probabilistic resources at one's disposal. It's overwhelmingly more likely that you're going to fail to randomly guess the correct PIN number if you're just punching in random numbers. And so that's essentially analogous to what we're dealing with when it comes to the origins of life and the evolution of life on our planet, is that universal probability bound gets swamped very, very quickly. The chances of the self-replicatability of an RNA molecule emerging in the primitive environment of the early Earth is, in my judgment, astronomically small. The getting these very specifically crafted proteins to have to work together in concert to achieve these higher level objectives, or getting an adult organism capable of reproduction from a zygote, a fertilized egg, is just way beyond what you can accomplish by chance and physical necessity. And the fossil record allows you sometimes to put a limit on how much time you have in terms of getting the A to B transitions that transpired in the history of life. So, for example, the human-chimp divergence is thought to have taken place by most evolutionary biologists about 6 million years ago. There was a paper published in 2008 in the Journal of Genetics by Rick Dewart and Dina Schmidt from Cornell University, where they basically sought to calculate, using a population genetics model, what's the waiting time that you would require to get 2-step non-adaptive mutations to in a transcription factor binding site. How long would that take, given what we know about the population size, the effective population size of hominids, which until very recently was in the 10,000 to 20,000 individuals per generation range, what we know about the generation turnover times and the average mutation rates. And they give an estimate of 216 million years for that 2-step codependent mutation. But guess what? You've only got 6 million years, according to the fossil record, for the entire transition. So that's known as the waiting time problem in evolutionary biology, which is also, I think, a formidable challenge. It's a numbers problem. And so I think that's also relevant to the universal probability bound.
One more follow up question on that, because we do want to get to we want to. We said we're going to talk about the resurrection, but given your background there, I just wanted to touch on a couple of other issues. But you've also interacted with Muslims in your discussions, and so given your background in biology, how are you not a Muslim, given the amazing scientific insights that you find in the teachings of Muhammad and in the Quran?
Yeah, and unfortunately, my own reading of the Quran reveals the Quran to be rather a scientific train wreck rather than a scientific miracle.
Wait. It's a scientific what?
It's a scientific train wreck.
Train wreck. Okay, go ahead. Just want to make sure I heard
Not,
that right.
not a scientific miracle. I've actually debated Nadir Ahmed, our old friend Nadir Ahmed, on this very topic, which is fun to watch. But yeah, I just don't find what the Quran says about modern science to be at all plausible. Stars are apparently missiles that Allah hurls at demons to strain their ears in the direction of the heavenly councils and so on. I mean, just up and down the line, the Quran just gets it wrong about science, as well as many other things, such as the historical anachronisms that we find in the Quran and the errors that the Quran makes in relation to Jesus and his crucifixion and so forth. So, I mean, the Quran is just a disaster zone as far as the evidence goes.
But haven't scientists discovered that semen is formed between the backbone and ribs?
No.
No.
I'm afraid, yeah, it's just one of the Quran's many blunders.
Yeah, it actually hasn't been pointed out enough. But when the Quran talks about the mingled fluids and so on, and then you go to the Hadith to figure out what this is talking about, that this is giving like the two semens theory that was common in the ancient world and would have been popular during the time of Muhammad and so on. And so it's just there's still awesome stuff to point out there.
Right.
But
Muhammad also seems to have been influenced by Galen, especially his stuff in embryology, which is also a mess, I think. But it was standard for the time period in which he was writing.
Yeah, it looks like. If you take some of the teachings of Galen and still of Aristotle and Hippocrates that were circulating during the time, and you combine that with some of the common Jewish theories there that were eventually recorded in like the Talmud, and you sort of put that all together, that's the science that you get from the Muslim sources, which now you have this double problem in the sense that one, the Quran and Muhammad are getting things massively wrong, but two, they're also being plagiarized, and so it's a double error. So interesting stuff. All right, so that's a little bit on science. Now, I asked you what you'd like to talk about, and you mentioned the maximal data approach to the resurrection, which would be in contrast to the minimal facts approach, which is used by Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona, to an extent, William Lane Craig. They all will put together sort of a short list of facts, 4 facts or 6 facts, or I think Habermas originally had 10 when he put it out, and then he added 2 more, and it was 12. And the general idea is here are facts that we have good evidence for, and that the overwhelming majority of scholars in these fields, New Testament studies or historical Jesus studies, these facts are granted by people from very diverse scholarly backgrounds, and they all grant these facts, and therefore whatever theory you're putting forward to explain what happened with Jesus that got Christianity off the ground, it at least needs to fit these facts. And if you don't fit these facts, then you've got a problem right from the beginning. So there are variations, but that's the general idea behind some of these minimal facts approaches. But you have a different approach. So anything you'd like to say about the minimal facts approach? Feel free to criticize it, and then talk about the approach you're using.
Sure. So I've long been rather critical of the minimal facts approach, and there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is, so as you rightly said, the criteria that Gary Habermas uses to adduce his minimal facts would be, number one, it has to, in Habermas's judgment, be well supported evidentially, and number two, it has to enjoy uh, scholarly support from more than 90% of scholars across the spectrum. Now, when the first problem, that, as I see it, is when Habermas is one of Habermas's criteria is the appearances, right? The appearances is widely accepted by more than 90% of contemporary scholars, which is to say, not necessarily that Jesus, in fact, appeared to his disciples. Rather, the apostles had experiences which they interpreted as manifestations of the risen Christ. And that is true. That is a minimal fact by Habermas's criteria. But when Habermas is pushed on alternative hypotheses, such as the hypothesis of mass hallucination, or some sort of some sort of objective vision, then Habermas's response, rejoinder to that particular concern, is to point out the implausibility of shared hallucinatory experiences. However, that takes him outside of his minimal fact criteria because that's no longer a minimal fact. The group experiences is not accepted by more than 90% of critical scholars, and nor, for that matter, is the multisensory nature of the resurrection encounters. And so Habermas has to switch his criteria midway through the argument. And so it feels to me a little bit like a bait and switch. Another problem is that Habermas likes to utilize 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, which I think does have evidential value, but I would be very hesitant to repose too much confidence on that oral creedal tradition alone. I think that the consensus of scholarship is probably correct, that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 is an oral creedal tradition that predates Paul's own writing of 1 Corinthians in 53 AD or thereabouts. But I think that it's no more than intelligent conjecture as to when and where Paul received that creed. So Habermas will say that that Paul received that creed perhaps in Jerusalem 3 years following his conversion, when he meets with Cephas and James, according to Galatians, the very people mentioned in that creed. But I mean, that's plausible, but I don't think that it's as securely established as Habermas would like. It's also very difficult to adjudicate the rationality of the apostles' beliefs unless we can say something about what the experiences were like. So 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 is consistent with alternative scenarios, such as a non-speaking Jesus, or a Jesus who appears only briefly and speaks only a few words and then disappears, or just very brief sightings at a distance, or something like that, which don't necessarily bode well for the rationality of the apostles' beliefs that it was really, in fact, Jesus risen from the dead. So the alternative approach that I prefer is, as you said, the maximal data approach. And this term was coined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Lydia McGrew. And basically, the maximal data approach asserts up front and argues for the hypothesis that the Gospels and Acts are substantially, even strongly reliable, being written by individuals who are well informed, close up to the facts, and habitually scrupulous. And that being the case, then one can reason that the claims in the Gospels and Acts concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus actually are reflective of what was being claimed and asserted by those who are purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, including its multisensory nature, involving multiple sensory modes, not just individual sightings, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, observing Jesus eating broiled fish in Luke 24, having breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in John 21. According to Acts 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period, so it's not just a brief and confusing episode, and so forth. And that's the sort of set of testimonial claims about which it's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. So when anyone makes any sort of claim, whether that be a sexual assault allegation or witness to a miracle, whatever it happens to be, there are three and only three broad categories of explanation that could explain why they made the claim. One is that they lied, one is that they're honestly mistaken, and one is that they're actually correct in their claim. And when we look at the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters in the Gospels, we find that it's very difficult to conceive of them being honestly mistaken. Another line of evidence, by the way, against them being honestly mistaken is in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul mentions that Christ is the first fruits from among the dead. And what he means by that is that Christ is the fulfillment of the first fruits feast, just as the first fruits in Leviticus 23 was the guarantor of the remainder of the harvest being delivered. So likewise, Christ is the first to be raised to glory and immortality ahead of the general resurrection at the end of the world. And according to Leviticus 23, the day on which the first fruits feast is to be commemorated is the day following the first Sabbath following the Passover, which would make it the Sunday. And so it's quite striking then that Jesus, in fact, does rise from the dead on the day that coincides with the Feast of First Fruits. That points to design rather than just being happy coincidence, either design on the part of the Gospels, according to all four of which Jesus rose on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, the Sunday, or it arises by design on the part of God himself. So again, pointing away from the hypothesis of being honest and mistaken. And then we've now redistributed the probabilities between two remaining contending hypotheses, namely Jesus in fact rose from the dead, or alternatively that they lied about it. And when one studies the context of the apostolic claim, we find that the apostles were voluntarily willing to undergo and endure sufferings and labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions and toils, and in some cases martyrdom, on account of their testimony of Christ risen from the dead. And so that goes a long way towards establishing their sincerity in making the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. And then you've also got other evidence as well that also corroborate that, such as the utilization across all four Gospels of women witnesses as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb and so forth, recognizing if they are making stuff up deliberately, by virtue of the fact that in first century Israel, which was a patriarchal society, the testimony of a woman was worth a fraction of that of a male witness and so forth. And so by reducing very, very dramatically the plausibility of those two contending alternative hypotheses or categories of explanation for the resurrection claim, namely that they were honestly mistaken or that they lied, you in turn redistribute the probabilities to render the hypothesis that God in fact raised Jesus from the dead as the most probable explanation of the pertinent evidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me give an actual example. So first, you're pointing out that if someone is making a claim about something that happened, it's possible that the person is lying. It's possible that the person is mistaken, not deliberately lying, but is just mistaken, believes it, but is wrong. And then there's the idea that the person is telling the truth. But there's actually a quick example here from over in the chat. So forgiveness with Allah is trying to argue that is over in the chat trying to argue that Rebecca was 3, so his God and his prophet affirmed the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah, including the book of Genesis, and yet forgiveness with Allah is trying to convince everyone that it's okay to marry and have sex with a 3-year-old girl, as an indirect way of defending Muhammad's relationship with a 9-year-old girl. And he wants everyone to believe in his religion so that we can all, I guess, marry 3-year-old girls or something like that. But he lays out his points here. He lays out his points defending it, expecting no one to actually look up any of these points. But I've seen these a million times before, and I've made videos on these. But look at what he says here. Because here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. The Bible never mentions the age of Rebecca. It only mentions, it only says that she's a young woman. It repeatedly calls her a young woman. And so you need to basically tie together different dates in the Bible to try and get something, to try and get an age for him. And when you look at the Muslim attempts to do this, they always include a lie. Always. There's always some bridge, and they hope no one will look at it. So look at what we have here. Point 3. This is what supposedly ties everything together. The incident on Mount Moriah, Genesis 22, and the birth of Rebekah happened at the same time. Really? Really? When Isaac was 36 or 37 years old, same time when Sarah died, and he gives Genesis 23, 1 through 3. Now, matter of fact, just to be quick, because this does actually illustrate your point, let's read Genesis 23, 1 through 3. So look, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking for a defense of the claim that the birth of Rebekah happened at the same time as the incident on Mount Moriah. You need that in order to get the dates here. Here's the source. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead, and said to the Hittites. And then it goes on into verse 4. So, ladies and gentlemen, three possibilities here, as Jonathan was pointing out. So, one, forgiveness with Allah is lying to us. Two, he's trying to tell the truth, but he's just getting it wrong. Or three, he's correct and he's not. So we can throw out the third option because he's not correct. So what are the options here? He's either lying or he's trying to tell the truth, but he's doing a bad job of it and he's getting things wrong anyway. He's honestly mistaken. I'm actually going with honestly mistaken because all he's doing is cutting and pasting an article from some horrible Muslim website. So what's actually going on here is eventually someone had to lie, right? But at some point someone had to lie. But then everyone copies the same lie and they pass on the lie, even though they think, oh, this is a great website. I don't need to examine anything on this website because anything on this website's good as gold. So I'll just cut and paste it and share it. And who cares if I'm wrong? And so the person's goal is not to deceive, even though you could criticize them for trying to promote pedophilia in the middle of a live stream. But look at what's going on here. So here you don't have to think that forgiveness with Allah is deliberately being deceptive, but he's getting things wrong. And you know that he's getting things wrong because you do a quick investigation. And then the options are either he's lying or he's honestly mistaken. So just wanted to point that out. And the point here is, ladies and gentlemen, whenever you're dealing with people who are copying stuff, you would definitely want to investigate it. Always look up the sources because, believe it or not, you have some people who are liars and you have people who pass on the lies in order to promote pedophilia. It's so weird to think that there are still people in the world today who, I have to show that it's okay to have sex with little girls. Very, very strange stuff. Now, that was all just one massive illustration of the point that you're kind of starting with, the three options that we need to consider. It seems like the big difference between the minimal facts approach and the maximal data approach would be that the minimal facts guys are trying to avoid reliance. They're trying to skip the step of defending the reliability of the Gospels and Acts. And it's sort of like your method entails a two-step system where first I defend these sources to show that these sources are accurate, and then what can we conclude based on those sources? Whereas they're trying to skip that step and say, okay, if we skip the reliability of those sources, except for specific instances where we defend a specific claim, we can just skip that and say, okay, here's what scholars agree to and what we have good evidence for, and let's build a case on that. Is that about right?
Yeah, unfortunately, though, I think for the minimal facts case, you cannot really build a robust case unless you can have the group appearances and preferably the multisensory character of the resurrection encounters. But that's not a minimal fact by those criteria. So I think that when the audience realizes just how little is actually granted by the consensus of scholarship, I think the argument becomes a lot weaker, at least it certainly rhetorically, as well as yeah.
So on that point, so for everyone for whom this is like new stuff, I'm talking about general case for the resurrection type stuff. Scholars almost across the board, so atheist scholars, liberal Christian scholars, agnostic scholars, Jewish scholars, almost everyone will grant at the scholarly level. Almost everyone grants that some of the disciples had some sort of experiences that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus. But I had a live stream with Bart Ehrman. I was asking him about that, and it seems like I could be getting this wrong, but it seems like he's granting an appearance to Peter, an appearance to Mary Magdalene, and one to Paul, and then maybe James. He's sort of, who knows, but then. Yeah, once you get to were there group hallucinations, things are a bit more shaky there. Whereas the group appearances are pretty significant in terms of ruling out hallucinations, because it's one thing for Peter to see some sort of hallucination, a grief hallucination or something like that. it's something you're in a completely different world as far as a group of people all seeing a hallucination, because then now you're kind of ruling out hallucinations by the very idea. So what you're it sounded like what you were saying is the minimal facts guys, they're treating the appearances as a fact and saying, but scholars, across the board grant appearances, but if you look at the specifics of what the scholars grant, they're not actually granting the group appearances, which you kind of need to rule out the hallucinations.
Exactly. And also another feature of Habermas's work, which I have problems with, is that he doesn't carefully distinguish between a scholar that might give a wholehearted endorsement of a particular fact versus one that says, yeah, it's slightly more likely than not, or somewhat plausible. And without making those distinctions, I think that that also has the potential, unfortunately, to mislead. So that's also a vulnerability, I think, of Habermas's work.
Now, what would you think? And we can obviously go into more detail about your approach here in a second. But what would you think about like a sort of combination approach? Like, say, if we just go with some of the historical facts that are granted across the board, even if we narrow them down to things that we can actually that everyone actually agrees on, and then saying, here's the case that you could build with that. But here, if you bring in more data by defending these sources, then you have these additional facts that go on, and here's what you could conclude. What would you think about that? Because
Yeah, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Habermas's approach is of no evidential value. I think that you can adduce some evidence from 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. I think that the individual encounters, the individual experiences do contribute evidential value. I just am not convinced that it would be sufficient to convince me of the resurrection if I was limiting the scope of my analysis to the minimal facts case. And so that's why I appeal to a broader data set. And I think that as Christians, we should consider it a privilege, not a burden, to defend the reliability of the Gospels and Acts, because the evidence for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts and the grounding in credible eyewitness testimony is absolutely spectacular. And so it's a privilege, not a burden, to defend that.
what would you what dates would you give for the Gospels and Acts? Because it's pretty common to see. Well, it's pretty common to see this. In Mark, you have Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem. That's around 70. Mark's the beginning, and so around 70 for Mark, and then everything after that at some point after that. So after that for Luke, because Luke draws on Mark, and then Acts is part two of Luke Acts, so Acts after that. So what dates would you put on the Gospels and Acts?
Good question. So I'm non-committal on dates. I think that there's a lot of conjecture that goes into assigning dates to the Gospels. I'm not a fan of that argument that you just elaborated, because of course, I believe in the potential of Jesus to make supernatural predictions about the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So that doesn't necessarily commit me to saying that Mark has to be written 70 or just slightly post 70 or what have you. And there's some internal evidences in the Gospels that might suggest that they're quite a bit earlier than that. So, for instance, an argument that's not conclusive on its own, but it does have some evidential value, is the fact that, as has often been pointed out, that Acts ends on kind of a cliffhanger with Paul being placed under house arrest, and it doesn't give you an account of Paul's death. It doesn't mention the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, doesn't mention the great fire that broke out in Rome in AD 64 and the ensuing persecution of the Christians and so forth. And particularly, it doesn't mention Paul's demise. Paul seems to have had another Roman imprisonment. If you read the pastoral letters, it doesn't mention that. So that suggests, I don't think it's completely conclusive, but it suggests that Acts was written prior to those events, perhaps in the early 60s AD. I say it's not conclusive because it's an argument from silence, though perhaps a better argument from silence than many other arguments from silence, but nonetheless an argument from silence. So I don't think it's completely conclusive. But if Acts is dated around then Luke has to be earlier still. And Mark and Matthew are usually thought to be earlier than Luke, and so that would push them even further back. There is also a quotation of Luke's gospel in 1 Timothy 5:18, where it says, "For the scripture says, do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages." And it's quoting from, I think it's Luke 10. I think it's verse 7, where it's quoting Jesus from the Gospel of Luke, and it refers to it as scripture. And I actually think that the pastoral letters are genuinely Pauline. I have a very detailed essay on my website where I defend the Pauline authorship of the pastoral letters. That being the case, then Luke has to predate if he is really referring to Luke as opposed to some earlier source that Luke is drawing on, which I think is quite plausible. Then Luke has to predate the writing of the pastoral letters, which would place Luke fairly early, perhaps even as early as the 50s, and then Matthew, Mark would be earlier still. So, as I said, I'm non-committal on dates, but I think that they certainly have to be written. They have to be written early enough in order to be anchored in substantially reliable and credible eyewitness testimony, because that's what the evidence really points to.
All right, so everyone, when you're seeing dates for the Gospels and Acts, everyone, it's important to keep the methodologies in mind as far as the bare overarching methodology. One approach, if you're not granting Jesus the ability to predict the future. So if you have especially a naturalistic framework in mind, then you'd say, okay, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts the fall of Jerusalem. That didn't happen until 70, so that must have been around the time when it was written, or after that. And then the other Gospels use Mark as a source, and so they must be later. Notice there are assumptions built into that methodology, and they're not completely correct. Even if you wanted to say Jesus can't predict the future, you wouldn't actually have to have supernatural knowledge. Jesus could just look at the way things are going and say, wait a minute, you guys keep rebelling against the Romans are going to come and crush you, and they're going to rip all your stuff down, because that's what the Romans do. So you wouldn't even have to have supernatural knowledge. So that's not a terribly great assumption to build all your dating on. But look, if you didn't have that assumption, and you just looked at when does it look like these things were written? Well, what Jonathan was pointing out, the book of Acts looks like it's written in the early 60s. And the reason Jonathan gave is that's sort of where it ends. It sort of fizzles out. And then, but all this stuff happened right after that. It's like, why is not that stuff put in there? Like, you've got the martyrdom of Paul. You'd have the martyrdom of Peter. You've got all this stuff the fall of Jerusalem. You got all this stuff that happens right after Acts ends, and it's not in there. And so this would be like me writing, let's say I wrote a book, I write a biography of Michael Jackson, and I end it when he comes out with Thriller. I mean, it would seem odd to end there, unless you're just trying to get to where he releases Thriller, something like that. But the question is, why don't you've got all this stuff that happens after that, and then ultimately his death and so on? Why aren't you including that? But notice you could have some sort of explanation for ending at Thriller, like maybe you just want to build up to that great moment or something like that. But imagine it just ends on some completely, relatively insignificant point in Michael Jackson's life, and that's where your book ends. It's like, why did you end there? Especially if there's all this awesome stuff that happened later. And so applying that methodology, you got Luke, looks like Acts is written in the early 60s. And then so you sort of reverse the process. You say, okay, so Acts came after Luke. So Luke is before that, and Luke incorporated Mark as a source. And now you're dealing with Mark like in the 50s or something like that. And so anyway, the point there is a lot of assumptions going into this. Jonathan has pointed that his methodology doesn't rely on specific dates. They just need to be early enough to where they're giving accurate information. So where would you like to? We got about 15 minutes left. Where would you like to go in terms of you could give more because you seem to have a two-step process: defend the sources, then what you can draw and gather from those sources and build your case there. Do you want to talk more about details that you can know given the reliability of the sources, or more on the reliability of the sources?
Let's give a few examples of evidences that we can adduce to corroborate the grounding of the Gospels and Acts in reliable eyewitness testimony. So let me give you just a couple of examples from the Gospels and a couple from Acts. So to take a couple of Gospel examples, only resurrection of Jesus that's found in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And if we go over to John chapter 6, we have John's account of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And in verse 5, it says, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to baptize so these people may eat? And that raises a question immediately in the mind of the attentive reader. why does Jesus turn to Philip here in particular? Why not say Judas Iscariot, who's in charge of the money bag, or something like that? Well, if we go over to chapter 12 of John's account, this is in an unrelated section of John's Gospel, 6 chapters later, a different Passover feast. And it mentions in verse 20 that there were some Greeks at the feast of Passover who wanted to talk to Jesus. So they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And so it adds in parenthesis here that Philip was from the town of Bethsaida, very casually brought in to the account. Now, if we go over to Luke's account, which is the parallel of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, in Luke chapter 9, we learn that the event of the feeding of the 5,000 actually takes place in Bethsaida. That's in verse 10. On the return, the apostles told him all they had done and taught, all they had done, and he took them on the drew apart to a town called Bethsaida, and that's where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place. And so by extracting information from John's account in John 6, from John 12, and from Luke 9, we can build a complete explanation for why Jesus might speak to Philip in John 6:5, because he's a local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread. But that's not something that's spelled out explicitly for the reader. One has to do the detective work of putting those puzzle pieces together, and that sort of casual interlocking, or this artless dovetailing, this undesigned coincidence, is rather surprising on the work of historical fiction, but is not hugely surprising if this is genuine historical reportage. Now, there's also an account of this miracle in Mark chapter 6. So Mark tells us in Mark chapter 6 and verse 31, he said to them, "Come away by ourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." And so it gives you a picture of the hustle and bustle of the place. It's very busy. They can't find leisure to eat their lunch. And so Jesus has them come away to a deserted area to eat. But unfortunately for them, the crowds follow. And it says in verse 39 that Jesus commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, in Israel, the grass is actually not green, but it's brown throughout the majority of the year, except at a relatively narrow window of time during the spring because of the higher levels of rainfall that coincides with the Feast of Passover. Now, when we go over to John's account, John does not mention the people coming and going, indicating how busy it is. He also doesn't mention the green grass, but he does mention in verse 4 a detail that's not found in Mark, namely that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand, which then illuminates and corroborates Mark's gospel. So that's that's two examples of one species of evidence that corroborates the grounding of the Gospels in testimony of individuals who are close up to the facts and well informed. An example from the Book of Acts.
The Book of Acts. One second. So okay. This is going to be a different example, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure everyone's sort of understanding it here and make sure I understand it. So the idea behind the undesigned coincidences would be, so you have some detail described in, let's say, the book of John, and there's some detail there, and it seems like an insignificant detail. It's like, okay, I have no idea why that little detail is there. It doesn't add a lot to the story. And then you'll have like a different gospel, and you'll have a different detail added that seems like, not a lot of weight placed on that little detail. But you start combining these, and they start explaining each other. And so you have things like that, but then if you have a bunch of them, it's sort of like they're forming a kind of like interconnected web of confirmation where there's all these little spots where they're confirming and explaining each other. And you were talking about this in terms of confirming that this goes back to people who knew what they were talking about. Their stories are actually, they have all of this internal confirmation where they're confirming each other. But I'm assuming there would be the added argument that this is God piecing this thing together. Is that part of the like case for divine inspiration, like that's so interconnected in there, or is this just in terms of like historical reliability?
No, this is just in terms of historical reliability. I do believe that God dictates scripture, right? I'm not a dictation theorist when it comes to inspiration. I do think most informed Christians would be dictation theorists, but this certainly points to the historical trustworthiness of these sources. And I emphasize that it is a cumulative case. So I'm not resting the argument on two examples. I'm just giving you two examples to whet your appetite and give you a flavor of this species of evidence. And there's dozens upon dozens of these that crisscross the documents, and that's just one species of evidence. There's also other types of evidence, such as extra-biblical corroborations of incidental details in the Gospels. You've got what I call the similarities between the Gospels, which are the unity of people's characters. There's various other lines of evidence that one could adduce. Unexplained allusions would be another. Now, let me go over to the book of Acts to give a couple of examples of undesigned coincidences there, which indicates, I think, that the author of Acts was indeed someone who was well acquainted with Paul's travels. And I would argue this evidence is best explained by Luke actually being someone, he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So if we go over to 1 Corinthians 4, and Paul wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. We know that because he sends greetings from Aquila and Priscilla at the end of the letter, and we know from Acts they traveled with him. He met them in Corinth, and they traveled with him as far as Ephesus. And he also makes an allusion to remaining in Ephesus in 1 Corinthians. So he's writing from Ephesus in Asia Minor, and he's writing to the Corinthian church, which is across the Aegean Sea from Corinth and from Ephesus, and Corinth is the capital of Achaia, what we now know as Greece. And he says in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 17, "That's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ." And so at the time of his writing to the Corinthian Christians from Ephesus, he's already dispatched Timothy. He's sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth. And then when you get to chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, we learn in verse 10, it says, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord as I am." And so even though he's already sent Timothy, we now understand that he nonetheless expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy arrives. How does that work? Well, we'd infer that Timothy must have taken an indirect route to Corinth, and the letter presumably went a more direct route. Now, the most direct way to send a letter from Ephesus to Corinth would be over the Aegean Sea from Ephesus to Corinth and by boat. We'd infer then that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia on his way around from Ephesus to Corinth. Now, when you turn over to the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 19, which concerns when Paul is in Ephesus, we read in Acts chapter 19, verse 21 to 22, it says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia," that's where Corinth is, by the way, "and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." So Paul remains behind in Ephesus, and he sends Timothy up through Macedonia, exactly as you would expect, given those clues in 1 Corinthians. But it doesn't even mention that Corinth is the destination of Timothy, but it fits in an artless and casual and undesigned way. Notice also that Timothy's traveling companion on this expedition is Erastus. Now, Erastus, we learn from Romans 16, was actually the city treasurer of Corinth. 2 Timothy 4 also mentions Erastus remaining at Corinth. And so Corinth is Erastus' hometown. So it's quite fitting then that Timothy should be traveling with Erastus. Erastus actually we have archaeological evidence for, because there was a pavement slab recovered from the ruins of ancient Corinth that mentions that Erastus laid down this pavement at his own expense, right? He paid the expense of this pavement. And so this is an incredible example. And just there's actually just taking Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians, never mind the other letters in the New Testament, I can already adduce more than 40 examples of that sort of undesigned coincidence between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. So I think that undesigned coincidences is a very powerful way to argue internally for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts.
So I just know from experience there are lots of different levels of background in this information with people in the. Some people will be familiar with the approach. For some people, this will be completely new information. So, the general idea here is, if let's say me and some people I know, we're all describing the events of the past 20 years, but we're focusing on different things, and I might be focusing on this, and they might be focusing on that. But we let's say we generally know each other, and some of those things overlapped. Some of our encounters overlapped with each other, and then years later we all write accounts of what happened. you could actually compare our accounts and find all these things where things are matching up, where I'm explaining something in more detail that this other person only mentioned, and these undesigned coincidences where I just mention some seemingly insignificant detail and someone else does, but then they sort of tie into each other and help explain what the other person is saying, and so on. So if you have this situation, you have, let's say, my story and some other person's story and some other person's story, and you can tie them together. The more of these things you have, the more it looks like we're actual people who are talking about events that we witnessed or that we have very good evidence of. Whereas the alternative is, if it's me making up a bunch of stuff and another guy making up a bunch of stuff and another guy making up a bunch of stuff, it seems extraordinarily, insanely unlikely that they're going to be in the situation of constantly confirming each other when you start comparing them. Is that about that the general idea?
Exactly. That was an excellent summary. Mm-hmm.
All right. So, and you mentioned that. So you mentioned a couple of examples, but you're saying there are lots of these.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned in the description, I have a couple links here. Where would people find more information on that? So you have your website here, jonathanmcclatchie.com. Is that a good place to go?
Yeah, jonathanmcclatchie.com is my own blog. I also recommend a couple of good YouTube channels which cover this in some detail. So my own, of course, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. I touch on this in some of my interviews and talks and debates I've done. Also, I recommend Lydia McGrew's YouTube channel. And I also recommend Testify, which is Eric Manning's YouTube channel, which is also an excellent place to go on all things New Testament reliability. And then in terms of literature, I recommend Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View: Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. I also recommend her other two books, which are The Mirror of the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, as well as her third book, which is The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John's Historical Reportage. William Paley is also a good place to go, especially for examples in the book of Acts. He wrote an excellent work called Hore Paulini, which means, translated from the Latin title, it means the times of Paul. And of course, William Paley's book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, is also excellent. So there's a few good resources for y'all to check out.
Now, your article here, I have a link to your article on Dr. McClatchie's case for the resurrection. So what will people find there? Like
So that's
what level is that on? Like level 10 being scholarly and level 1 being like total beginner. What level would you put that at?
perhaps 7. So it's basically it's the evidential value of Luke Acts to the case for the resurrection. So it shows how you can limit the scope of your analysis just to Luke and Acts, and how far you can go in making the case for the resurrection. And I argue that you can actually go quite far in developing that case.
And one more thing that I definitely wanted to get to before we sign off here. You have a ministry. I have the link here in the description box. Talkaboutdoubts.com. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so talkaboutdoubts.com is a ministry that I launched in December of this past year, last year in 2021. It's basically a spin-off of something I'd been doing on my own personal website since 2016, which was mentoring Christians who have doubts concerning the veracity of the Christian faith, of the gospel. And so basically, since 2016, on my personal website, I've had a form that people could fill out, and then I would set up a one-on-one Zoom call to talk with them about their doubts. And it's been a long-standing passion of mine, and I've long been fascinated about why people leave Christianity, and I love to talk to people that wrestle with doubts about their faith. And so more recently, in 2021, I decided to launch this new ministry called talkaboutdoubts.com, where I would bring together and assemble a team of scholars and experts and thinkers who are willing to do private Zoom calls with Christians who are wrestling with intellectual doubts, as well as ex-Christians who want to explore whether there might be a rationally honest way back to faith. And so we have currently over 50 scholars on our team. Some of these scholars will be well known to your audience, I'm sure. We've got people like Dr. Timothy McGrew, who's a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. We have people like Dr. Max Baker-Heitch, who's a philosopher at University of Oxford, excellent thinker. We have Dr. Stephen Myers, a Cambridge-trained philosopher of science. We've got we've got Dr. Titus Kennedy from Biola University. He's an biblical archaeologist who specializes especially in the Old Testament, though he's also written a book now on the New Testament archaeology. So we've got archaeologists, New Testament scholars, Hebrew scholars, like we've got C. John Collins, for example. We've got Old Testament scholars, New Testament scholars. We've got philosophers, biochemists. We've got psychologists and therapists and pastors that are able to help out in particular on people's emotional doubts as well. And we also have now just launched a new branch of this ministry, which is a Discord community for people who are former inquirers of talkaboutdoubts.com, which helps us to stay in touch and continue to mentor and disciple Christians who are struggling with doubts. And we also host weekly hangouts on Zoom, which are on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. for people who are 9 p.m. Eastern for people who are former inquirers of talkaboutdoubts.com. And we are planning to launch a series of weekend retreats as well for Christians who are struggling with doubts concerning the veracity of the Christian faith. So that's a little bit about talkaboutdoubts.com.
Again, because there's kind of a big problem here that I see over and over and over again when I hear from or when I talk to someone who grew up as a Christian and then eventually left Christianity in college or something. I see this repeating story over and over again. Then I asked my mom about this issue and my mom couldn't answer me. So I realized that Christianity doesn't have answers for this, right? I see that, or I asked my pastor and he couldn't explain this to me. So I realized that this isn't true. And normally I'm thinking, well, if your mom can't answer this, it's possible that it's because there's no explanation for this. But why, in the name of common sense, would you think if your mom can't answer something that there's no answer for? So what you're saying is you guys are you're filling this need by saying, okay, we've got experts in various fields, and so someone would go to the website, someone who's struggling with doubts, and saying, I really saw this. I was watching this Richard Dawkins video, and he said this, and it really makes sense, and so I'm doubting my Christianity. You're saying they would go to your website, they would fill out something that basically explains what their doubts are, and that you would match up with a person who would be well informed in that field to talk to the person about the issues that are bothering them.
Exactly. So basically the way it works is that someone goes to the website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and submits a form which we distribute to the scholar that would be most appropriate to addressing that question. And different scholars on our team have different frequencies with which they're willing to take questions. So some people take questions once a week, other people once a month or once every 6 weeks or what have you. And so we distribute that to one of our scholars, and then that scholar will get in contact with that individual directly and schedule a Zoom call. And that could be a one-on-one call or sometimes a two-on-one call. And then we often do follow-up. It's not uncommon for us to do multiple calls with people and to continue the relationship and to help them to work to not only address their doubts, but also to develop protocols for working through doubts in an intellectually responsible and honest way. So we help people, for instance, to distinguish between a question versus an objection. Not all questions are objections, but a question can be made an objection by adding additional premise, either that we do know the answer and it entails some sort of internal inconsistency or is at odds with empirical evidence, or we don't know the answer and that entails that. And if Christianity were true, we should expect to know the answer. Short of that additional premise, the question is only a question. We also help people to distinguish between low stake versus high stake objections. An objection to, for instance, a lot of people who are deconverts grew up in a very hyper conservative, rigid, fundamentalist background, and basically equated Christianity with adherence to the idea that the earth is 6,000 years old. And I would consider that more of a low stakes objection because there are alternative hermeneutical frameworks for understanding the early chapters of Genesis, which are quite consistent with an old earth paradigm or perspective. So one could very well, I would argue, it's more rational to revise one's theology in cases like that rather than ditch Christianity in toto. We try to help people to think through these sorts of issues. How do we think about evidence? How do we make sense of the fact that Christianity, like most complex topics, it has evidence both for and against. The evidence can sometimes be messy, and to encourage people to be content with less than absolute certainty, but having enough evidence to be tremendously confident in the truth of the gospel and to be able to be comfortable with there being facts and evidence on both sides of the question. But the trends of evidence tend to, in my judgment at least, confirm the veracity of Christianity over and above the falsehood thereof.
All right. Well, that sounds like a very, very significant and much needed ministry today. In fact, I might want to, for people who don't, some people don't watch long live streams and so on, but remind me if I forget, Jonathan, but I like to make a commercial for that, just a nice little commercial at some point, pointing people to that ministry, just so, well, it's important just not for people who have doubts, but it's important for, parents and friends and so on to know where to go if, someone comes up to them and says, hey, this has really been bothering me. And if you're a parent or, you're a friend of this person and you don't know how to answer, hey, why not give them a link and tell them to fill out the form.
Absolutely. We get a lot of requests from parents as well, and parents whose kids have walked away. So even if you yourself are not struggling with doubts, but you know someone who is, feel free to direct them to this resource. Or if you just want to chat with us about how you can be a resource for your kids who walked away from the faith, if you're a parent, then this resource is for you as well. We also talk to pastors who are doubting their faith and people in full-time ministry. We keep people's information completely confidential, so you're also more than welcome to reach out to us with your doubts and concerns and questions as well.
All right. Well, thanks to Dr. Jonathan McLatchie for joining us here and talking about some of his background, his work in science and on the resurrection, and a little bit with Islam as well, and his awesome, sounds like an awesome ministry. Again, links to those things are all in the description box. Be sure to check them out, and we'll catch you all next time.